One major role of the sensory receptors is to help us learn about the environment around us or about the state of our internal environment. Sensory receptors help to convert the various stimuli into the electrochemical signals of the nervous system. Stimuli are described as the environmental changes, either external or internal, that cause sensory nerves to create and fire action potentials. So diagrammatically, we can show this as a particular stimulus being sensed by a sensory receptor. Sensation is the activation of sensory receptors by that stimulus. The activation of the sensory receptor will then cause a sensory neuron within a sensory nerve to fire action potentials. These action potentials are then sent to and interpreted by the central nervous system, where they are perceived by the central nervous system. Perception is described or defined as the processing of the sensory stimulus into a meaningful pattern. We may not always be aware of this perception, as the conscious levels of the brain, like the cerebral cortex, may not receive the information from that particular stimulus or from that particular sensory nerve. Regardless of whether we are aware of that particular stimulus occurring or not, the central nervous system will cause an appropriate response to occur by stimulating a muscle or gland, which will then carry out the body's response to that initial stimulus. There are a few receptor types. For instance, we have neurons that have free nerve endings, which are quite simply the dendrites of a sensory neuron that are embedded within a tissue. Sensory neurons with more complex receptors will have their dendrites embedded within a connective tissue capsule or a connective tissue structure, which will help enhance their sensitivity to stimuli, like touch, stretch, or pressure. Or the receptor may be highly specialized to detect very specific stimuli. For example, the receptors in the retina of the eye that detect light and images. In the examples that we will examine, we'll focus on the free nerve ending and encapsulated receptor types. Here we will consider some of the general senses, whose receptors are spread throughout the body rather than being associated with one specific structure or organ. The special senses, on the other hand, have receptors that are associated with one organ, and they detect very specific stimuli, such as vision, taste, hearing, and smell. Free nerve endings are simple sensory receptors that consist only of the dendrites of a sensory neuron. One benefit to this simple structure is that they can detect a variety of stimuli. The primary locations of free nerve endings are that they are found throughout the dermis, within the cornea of the eye, so that is the clear part of the eye that is just anterior to the iris and the pupil, the joint capsules of synovial joints, as well as a variety of visceral organs, such as the digestive, urinary, and reproductive system organs. The free nerve endings sense temperature. Some are only sensitive to warm or hot temperatures, while others are only sensitive to cold temperatures. They also sense mechanical movement, such as the movement of a joint capsule during motion, or they sense painful stimuli, such as touch, temperature, or movement that goes beyond a certain threshold. Mechanoreceptors are another type of sensory receptor, and these mechanoreceptors are also referred to as Merkel discs. These sensory receptors are located at the junction between the epidermis and the dermis. Specifically, the Merkel cells are located in the deepest parts of the epidermis, the stratum basale. The mechanoreceptors sense low-frequency vibrations, such as when you drag your finger across a textured surface, and the surface causes your finger to vibrate. The bulbous corpuscles are nerve endings that are embedded within the dermis and within synovial joint capsules. They function to sense stretching of the skin, so that is for those corpuscles that are embedded within the dermis, or stretch and movement of the synovial joint capsules, so for those bulbous corpuscles that are embedded within the joints. In the joints, these sensory receptors help to tell our brain the position of our skeleton and the position of our joints, so that the brain can plan and coordinate movements. The tactile corpuscles are located in the papillary layer of the dermis, so that is, this is the superficial-most layer of the dermis. The tactile corpuscles are not equally distributed across the entire body surface, however. They are more highly concentrated in the fingertips and in the lips, which is why these areas are particularly sensitive. They function to sense very light or gentle touches, as well as low-frequency vibrations. The lamellar corpuscles are sensory neurons that are wrapped in layers of connective tissue and are primarily located deep within the dermis. Because of their depth, they sense deep pressure on the skin as well as high-frequency vibrations. The hair follicle plexus are the dendrites of sensory neurons that are wrapped around hair follicles. These function to sense the movement of the hairs and allows the hairs to function as sensory structures. Muscle spindles are sensory receptors that are located within skeletal muscles. Specifically, they are parallel to nearby skeletal muscle cells or skeletal muscle fibers. These function in sensing the contraction as well as the stretch of muscles during body movements, and they help to provide feedback to the brain about muscle length. This feedback is particularly important so that the stretch reflexes can occur if muscles are stretched beyond a specific threshold length. This helps prevent the muscle from being overstretched and potentially damaged. And finally, we have tendon stretch organs, which are similar to the muscle spindles because they detect the movement of stretch of tendons, that is, instead of the movement and stretch of skeletal muscles. These sensory receptors are found embedded between the collagen fibers that compose the tendons.